Hi, I'm Shelby Nichols.
And I'm Shelby Parks, and we're doing our presentation on Chapter 1 in the book Queen for a Day, titled Belleza Venezolana.
The Venezuelan woman has no prototype, and for that reason, neither does Miss Venezuela. I believe that the Venezuelan woman, because she is not so marked, is very international, and that is what is interesting about her. She can be morana, dark-skinned, black, white, blonde, red-headed, everything. She stands out in the international competition for her clothing, her way of acting, how she moves, how she walks, how she makes herself appealing. When they see her arrive, they all say, "This girl must be Venezuelan." Osmel Sosa, president of the organization Miss Venezuela.
So the chapter is called Belleza Venezolana, which means Venezuelan beauty, and basically it's kind of made up of four elements: nation, race, market, and media. And all of these kind of come together through the history of beauty competitions in Venezuela.
The title can also refer to the national fantasy that is beauty queens in Venezuela.
Yeah.
The beauty contests in Venezuela have allowed them to participate in the global market.
Right. And like a national beauty queen is really only conceivable once a nation like begins to see itself as needing a representative. That's kind of from one of the quotes. And basically they're creating like a national brand, like how people say like that's on brand.
Yeah.
It's like the nation's brand. It's funny because I didn't know there was a difference between like a pageant and a contest before we read the book.
Right. But it does state that a beauty contest is an event in which the beauty of individuals is judged. A beauty pageant is a form of a beauty contest that involves pageantry.
It's interesting because the first beauty contest in Venezuela wasn't a pageant, but it was a contest, and like the pageantry stuff doesn't come about until the 50s when we kind of get like the television craze. Oh, I guess I should rewind a little bit back to 1905. And that's when we have the very first national beauty contest, where the tobacco producer La Hidalguia held a contest, and it was like based on postcards.
Yeah, where people would vote on who was the prettiest woman.
Right. And if you remember, we were talking at the beginning about how this places Venezuela on the national market, and we know that tobacco is like a big import and export item, so this is obviously putting them on a global market.
Beauty contests obviously get political because everything has to be political.
An example of this is in 1915 when the Queen, named in Maracay, was announced as one of President Gomez's personal entourage.
Basically, meaning that his power influenced the contest.
Yeah. The most famous case of this is a beauty pageant in 1928 when they crowned the Queen of Students, Beatrice I. She's like a symbol for the student movement against President Gomez, who's kind of like a dictator. And the newspaper El Universal reported it, and it was kind of like well known because newspapers were heavily censored.
This launches pageants into the political sphere and gives them power, because I guess that's the only way women can get power.
Okay, so now let's talk about Elite.
Elite was a high society newsletter documenting the parties and social life of Caracas based elites.
Wait, even though El Universal was considered the national newspaper of record at the time?
Yeah, but listen to this. In the late 1920s, the then aristocratic magazine Elite ran photographs of many young, unmarried society women who were featured each issue as pretty girls.
Muchachas bonitas? Oh, scandalous.
They also announced a contest and set of assumptions about what constitutes a fair and representative contest.
So, just to be sure, pageantry, like as we know it, like toddlers and tiaras type of stuff, it wasn't like that way.
Yeah, it was photographs and magazines.
Once we move into more typical pageant style in the 30s, Venezuela drops the Senorita Venezuela title and they hold a contest to elect a Miss Caracas.
But larger than this was the Pan American World Airways organized the first Miss Venezuela competition in 1952 to select a delegate to represent Venezuela at the first competition, Miss Universe.
Yeah, but here comes the drama because in 1954, Pan Am withdrew its sponsorship of the Miss American Venezuelan competition because the Miss Venezuela of 1953 left her throne so she could get married.
And all the beauty pageant fans had to wait a long year for another competition to be announced in 1955. Let's talk about the queen from the 1944 Amateur Baseball World Series. This queen is rare because she is characterized by her Afro descent. This is important because racial ideology in Venezuela is different than the American racial ideology.
In America, we mostly think of things in terms of black and white.
While Criollo itself is a colonial racial category that refers initially to the descendants of Spaniards born in the Americas, in contemporary Venezuela, this is a category of national belonging and racial hybridity.
Let's look at Susanna Dijon in these pictures. She won the Miss World in 1955. She signifies the floating racial categories that are typical in Venezuela.
But there is still a Eurocentric aesthetic in the Venezuelan beauty industry.
This is what the author is getting at when he says missing race.
This is hard for Americans to conceptualize, but in Venezuela, there is still a rejection of so called African features.
Here's a quote that represents this. Early in the morning on the day of the casting, she told my research assistant that she had done everything she could to minimize her hips, legs, and nose, including having liposuction performed on a tiny amount of fat between her thigh muscles. She told us that she was having a hard time breaking into the pageant because her legs look like baseball bats. The implication of this comment was that her legs are backs and backside were too thick, a feature that is associated with blackness in Venezuela.
This probably contributes to the success of Venezuelan beauty pageants worldwide. They overrepresent whiteness to make it more appealing to societal standards.
That's why it's so important to recognize Carolina Indriago, the only Afro-Venezuelan to ever win a Miss Venezuela pageant.
I'm reminded of this quote from the book. She's a white girl, but not overly white, white but tan, preferably with very straight hair, with eyes a little bit Asian, brown or light colored without blue or green.
Right. It's like the missing race, the lumping together and I guess generalization of beauty, but they like whiten it down.
The question of agency is precluded because individual actors cannot be held responsible for a larger social phenomenon. This feedback loop, which continues to abstract the mass mediated feminine form as it reinforces existing racial hierarchies, appears to have no end. It clearly reproduces a social order that values European bodies over those of others.
The book also talks about an art exhibit, 90, 60, 90. Those numbers represent the ideal measurements, quote unquote, and they kind of just, the art exhibit basically is just mocking that and kind of pointing out how this is like a Eurocentric and ultimately just not realistic expectation of beauty.
I guess these women's bodies, the body of the Miss, as the author puts it, are representing Venezuelan racial ideologies.
Sounds about white to me. They also show what modernity is in Venezuela.
This links to the discussion about sanitary citizenship. Sanitary citizens are people who are judged to be incapable of adopting this modern medical relationship to the body, hygiene, illness, and healing, or who refuse to do so, become unsanitary subjects.
Sanitary here is basically like medically enhanced. By representing the missing race, the Miss represents the geography of the nation.
But while its extreme popularity is widely recognized and the success of the Venezuelan misses is a point of national pride, the pageant itself is not considered an authentic expression of Venezuelan folklore.
Yeah, in recent years, the pageant scene has actually lost its connection with the population of Venezuela. Just given the turmoil in the country, it seems frivolous.
I want to move on to lay out the Porter framework.
Okay, so the first part is factor conditions, and this is like women's early involvement in pageants.
The second part is demand conditions. This is about the national passion for these contests.
Supporting and related industries is basically what they sound like: television stations, viewer demand, stuff like that.
And no model would be complete without the government, and its role in pageantry has already been explained.
From all these factors, we can all tell that the Miss Venezuela is successful and she's viewed as a valid industry.
Miss Venezuela is not just a source of national pride, she is a marker of modernity, of process and successful production, and a country in which the discourse of failure haunts the national project.
Here's another quote from the book. The silences and erasures that occur in this process of representation reveal tensions in center and periphery, national and social relations in Venezuela. The Miss has become, over the course of the history of the pageant, an iconic representation of all that is right and wrong about Venezuela, from its beautiful women to its preoccupation with frivolity, and most important, the Miss figure has become an incarceration of modernity.
The time period between the 50s and 60s in Venezuela is important because you have the rise of beauty queen as well as the undertaking of government projects. The nation was booming with modernity. It even transitioned from dictatorship to democracy.
So, in a land moving into the future, it seems odd to focus on something as small as a bag of cornmeal.
Cornmeal?
Harina pan is pre cooked corn flour packaged in shiny yellow orange plastic. It totally seems wild, but it's actually a national symbol.
Pan represents a clean, modern Venezuela, free of conflict and complications. A mammy figure who loses her blackness and becomes somehow a stylized, spit-curled Criolla beauty queen.
The Harina Pan Mammy sounds like a hybrid mammy with the Miss.
As we're reading this, I thought of the Aunt Jemima bottle for syrup. She represents abstraction and stereotypical otherness, but the Mammy shows the disappearance of blackness in the Venezuelan Miss, which also correlates to the reading. So there are three commercials that were talked about in the reading, and I actually was able to find all three of them on YouTube. So we have them running from the mid 1960s to the 1970s. The first two are in black and white, and the third is in color.
Ciudad cuatricentenaria, orgullo de la nación, capital extraordinaria del cielo y el corazón. Caracas, ¿cómo has cambiado desde aquella fundación? Pero el tiempo te ha dejado un caudal de tradición. 4 siglos han pasado, y aunque muchos pasarán, las arepas han quedado gracias a la harina pan. El arpa suena con su constante vibrar, así harina pan conserva su constante calidad. Harina Pan es calidad garantizada de auténtico buen sabor por sus granos seleccionados y perfecta elaboración. Harina Pan sí tiene lo que usted busca, calidad, calidad constante y criolla.
Por eso, señora, no ensaye, busque harina Pan y no falle.
From these videos, we can see that Harina Pan is the solution to maintaining Venezuelan national culture. The Miss here shows feminine modernity while resisting traditional labor. In the videos, the dancers and the machines represent modernization, but the national style of dance, in the case of Arepa Flower, represent tradition and traditional ideals. In the color clip that's not featured, the mammy is shown as black. She has brown skin, thicker lips, cheekbones, and a broader nose. Here we can again see the erasure of blackness in order to promote a racially charged ideal of beauty. La Negra Hippolyta is a legend about Simon Bolivar's wet nurse. Her and La Negra Matea are popular in national history for being the women who nurtured Bolivar. He is a key historical and military figure in Venezuela.
La Negra Hippolyta is featured on the logo of a Bolivarian mission. Their image is important because they show the African origins in Venezuela.
These two women are cited in the revolution to invoke blackness, femininity, nurturing, and women's labor.
Negra Hippolyta and Negra Matea were presented as strong maternal black women who signified the opposite of the myths. Chavez utilized their image to assert a Bolivarian aesthetic that embraces blackness and rejects Eurocentric aesthetics.
There was some conflict when two tankers refused to enter a port. There were three tankers named Susanna de Jong, Pilin Leon, Martiza Solero. After this, the last two ships were renamed because their namesakes were opponents of Chavez, but the Susanna de Jong kept her name and did not comment either way.
Here's a quote from the book. Negra Hippolyta represents the love and generosity of Venezuelan mothers, equity, solidarity, and justice for a population unattended in Venezuela and full of misery.
Today, the Mission Negra Hippolyta works to provide health care, food, and shelter to people on the street, including transformistas. Let's do a recall to the beginning of this presentation where we noted that Belleza Venezolana is produced through four important elements: nation, race, markets, and media. These elements are mutually exclusive, sutured together on the bodies of the misses through the iconity of the beauty contest.
We talked about how racial blurring is an important aspect as to Venezuelan beauty contest success on the global stage.
The issue of modernity was also addressed, and we can see that Venezuelans have found a wide range of strategies to negotiate systems of oppression.
This quote sums it up well. The rationalized regime of representation in Venezuela is marked by the sublimation of blackness and indigeneity, and a social anxiety about the threat that black and indigenous bodies pose to Venezuelan modernity. So, since we have come to a close, we have questions now. My first question would be, what do you guys think here in America is another version of the mammy figure besides Aunt Jemima?
And my question would be, do you think that American beauty contests or pageants are important on a global level like they are in Venezuela?